Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Welcome to day 15 of Teaser Season for patch 3.28, the upcoming Mirage League. Today will be a reasonably short video because we've had a couple of long ones over the last couple of days. But there have been three little changes Grinding Gear Games have made on the New Zealand Sunday to the patch notes. I want to go through those, and I also want to call to your attention a very useful Reddit thread. This is the Reliquarian. However, this is after someone has taken the screenshot from Grinding Gear Games' video, and then they have gone through it, and they've analysed all of the artwork that's presented there, and they've put what they think each item is. Now, we're going to get absolute confirmation tomorrow on what each of the Reliquarian Ascendancy notables does. They're not something that's hugely important to sink your teeth into now. One thing I will add, though, is that there have been two confirmed changes since this. Firstly, Hellcrack, it's out. Hellcrack's out of here. It's being replaced instead by the Brass Stone. This was confirmed by Natalia from Grinding Gear Games in a Reddit post. After that, Grinding Gear Games also confirmed that Widowhail is not going to have the same stats that were presented during the live stream announcement. So we'll find out the exact details there, but that's just a couple of things that are important to keep in mind. The Reliquarian Ascendancy will not look exactly like it does here, but it will still be recognizable to what you see here. Full details on that tomorrow. Let's get to the rest of the patch notes though. So we have one thing that is unequivocally a buff, one thing that is a massive single build nerf, and one thing that is a little bit less unclear. Let's start with the unclear one. Fixed a bug where Cyrus, Awakener of Worlds, and the Incarnation of Dread were dropping their uniques more often than intended while in a feared encounter. Now, what we don't know here is whether this increased chance for Cyrus, Awakener of Worlds, and the Incarnation of Dread to drop their loot was coming at the expense of other unique rewards from bosses that you would have got inside the feared encounter, or alternately, whether it was something that was just coming at no additional cost. So is this going to mean that there will be more Shaper and Elder and Cortex drops, or is this going to mean the same amount of Shaper, Elder, and Cortex drops? The answer is we kind of don't really know. We'll find that one out once people get into the feared in earnest, but that might take a little bit of time. Anyways, this one could be a nerf to feared loot. It could be a neutral change to feared loot. We'll have to see. Next, we have the changes that are taking place to chaining. So firstly, chain support is getting a pretty unequivocal buff here. This is something that bow players are probably pretty happy with, but it's important to note that the next line is a big one. So there are a couple of skills, and Cobra Lash is the highest profile of these. Lightning Strike of Arcing also fits into this category. There's probably more of them than I'm not thinking of, but these are projectile skills that chain. These have a very, 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 very powerful, very important Cluster Jewel exclusive notable. In fact, if you're playing a Cobra Lash build or you're playing a Lightning Strike of Arcing build, most of your damage actually doesn't come from anything that you stack on those gems. It comes from follow through. Let's go through 3.27's follow through. If you've got 10 remaining chains, one copy of follow through reads, projectiles deal 150% increased damage with hits and ailments. What if you've got 6 copies of this notable? Well, that's going to be 900% increased damage. Now, there's not diminishing returns, but there's also not escalating returns either on increased damage. And at some point, it's not worth scaling the number of these that you've got right into the stratosphere. You want to get it reasonably high, but there is a limit beyond which other types of investment like Critical Strike Multiplier become better. But this is an incredibly, incredibly powerful notable. Or at least, it was an incredibly powerful notable. It's still good, but it's getting the treatment that Purposeful Harbinger got quite a while ago. Purposeful Harbinger was the best notable that was available on the passive tree. And when I say that, I mean both between the classic passive tree and also from every extension you could potentially add to it through the use of Cluster Jewels. It was the Cluster Jewel exclusive notable, and it had the text at one point, auras from your skills have 10% increased effect on you for each herald affecting you. So, you could get 5 heralds on your character, actually now you can get 6, and then at that point, 1 copy of Purposeful Harbinger would give you 50% aura effect, 2 copies 100%, 3 copies 150%, 4 copies 200%, and so on and so forth. Completely and utterly busted. It ended up getting a double tap nerf that still left it a very powerful but kind of niche node. And that's where we are now. Purposeful Harbinger now has 8% instead of 10%, and on top of that, it's capped at 40%. But this is not a cap of 40% for each Purposeful Harbinger you've got. It is a character-wide cap. So if you've got 3 heralds on your character and 1 copy of Purposeful Harbinger, then you've got 24% increased effect of auras from your skills on you. But if you've got 2 copies of Purposeful Harbinger, that doesn't double to 48%, it instead doubles to the cap, which is 40%. If you've got 3 copies of Purposeful Harbinger, the third one does a whole lot of nothing. So that's Purposeful Harbinger. This nerf that took place at the end of 3.10 was very deserved, but it's also coming to follow through. And it's a big one. The new version of follow through, it's a little bit better in some circumstances, but those are the builds that weren't playing it anyway. The follow through notable cluster dual passive now grants projectiles deal 20% increased damage with hits and ailments for each remaining chain, up to 100%. Previously, 15% increased with no cap. So, essentially all the builds that weren't playing follow through, it's now better on. All the builds that were playing follow through, it's now considerably worse because you were definitely wanting to get this not to 100%, but to 900% or more. So that's basically something that means that if you were thinking of league starting Cobra Lash, maybe don't. However, it is possible that Cobra Lash might get a compensatory buff for this that hasn't been announced yet. It's something that feels like it needs it because so much of the gem's late game power, it's actually fine in the early game, but so much of its late game power came from this follow through stacking. With that aspect of building it closed, there needs to be something else. Otherwise, the gem's just not going to be playable. As for Lightning Strike of Arcing, it was less popular than Cobra Lash. It did the same thing, but most of the time it did it worse. And so people ended up playing Cobra Lash instead. And this also applies to Peacock of Bouncing. Peacock of Bouncing still very, 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 very good early game skill, even with this nerf in place, because early game, you don't have access to that cluster jewel anyway. However, Peacock of Bouncing, its very top end is nerfed hard by this, and that also means that Peacock of Bouncing is probably not going to see endgame play anymore, unless there's some sort of compensatory buff. That said, Peacock of Bouncing will continue to be a popular skill, just for the leveling experience only, not something people will stick to using once they're getting feared ready. So that's everything when it comes to the news for Path of Exile 3.28 Mirage League on day 15. I have one last thing I wanted to add in though, and that is that people notice that a lot of people on YouTube beg for likes and subscribes a lot more than I do. That's because it works, but I also find that it really starts to annoy people if you do it more than once in a blue moon. So I try to limit doing that twice a league, and I thought this would be the time that it would be appropriate to do it. So if you want to see my videos about 3 times as often in your recommendations on YouTube, then subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be actively nagged by YouTube when a new video goes up, which is much more intrusive, then you can also click the bell. But if you don't want that, you just want 3 times as often to see my videos, then hitting the subscribe button will achieve that. The other thing you can do is hit the like button. Doing this will be a stacking bonus along the lines of subscribing. So it'll be a more multiplier to how often you see my videos, but it will be for a limited time period. On top of that, it also appears that when you hit like on the video, especially if they happen early in the video's lifespan, that tends to result in the video being propagated to more other people. So it's presented to more people, and then on top of that, you'll also see my videos more often in the future. Of course, if you're not interested, you don't need to do either of those things either. And that's all we got for today. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results.